Hello, everyone. I am Brent Steele of the University of Utah. I am very pleased to be part of this video abstract for the Review of International Studies article on the politics of partisan memory, last letters of anti-fascist resistance in Italy and France from 1943 to 2003. I am very pleased to be joined by the authors of the article, Alexandra de Ciantis is a PhD candidate in political theory in the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. Her research contributes to the fields of contemporary democratic theory, memory studies, and the history of political thought, with a focus on the Italian political tradition and Antonio Gramsci. She has been my Gramscian translator, and I don't just mean from Italian. So, Alexandra, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brent, for having us.
And then I'm also joined by Professor Daniel R. Brunstetter, who is a professor of political science at the University of California, Irvine. His work on the ethics of war spans the historical to the contemporary, including theories such as the history of the just war tradition, contemporary debates about the use of force, and the lived experience of war, which this article is definitely in that category. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you, Brian.
So now I'd like to turn it over to the authors to introduce and provide an overview of their absolutely outstanding article.
So thank you so much, Brent, for the introduction. I think a really good place to start is to talk about the letters themselves, what they are, who the authors were. So the last letters were written by partisans who were executed for their anti-fascist resistance by fascist and Nazi forces between 1943 and 1945. And they were composed mainly in prison cells, often just hours before their execution. Across the collections, there's a notable plurality amongst the authors. We have men and women from differing classes, party affiliations, education levels, faiths, regional and national origin. And each was united in opposition to fascism, yet their letters convey diverse moral and political convictions through which they justified their resistance and, as we show in the article, their partisanship and political action. So, after the war, societies emerging from the experience of fascist totalitarianism faced the dilemma of how to remember the resistance as a struggle for political freedom while preserving the plurality of the voices of those who participated. And in post-war Italy and in France, this dilemma of who and what political values should guide the transition from fascism to democracy came to center on the last letters and their legacy. But the ways in which the major political parties in the post-war period engaged with them often undermined their plurality and their democratic ideals, specifically their demand for popular sovereignty. So our central claim in the article is that these letters provide a plural democratic memory of the resistance, and that remains vital to safeguarding democracy against present authoritarian threats that are neo-fascistic today. So to explore how this potential was kind of facilitated and either facilitated or constrained by political parties, we look at their and compare their partisan uses in Italy and France, specifically the role of the French Communist Party and also the Italian Communist Party. And these contrasting memorial trajectories for us raise, we believe, a very important question for political theory and for memory studies as well, which is what is lost when the memory of resistance becomes depoliticized, as was the case in Italy, or monopolized by a single party, as was the case in France, which we're going to discuss a little further. And so we approach the politics of partisan memory, as we call it, through what we theorize as the public party tension. So democratic theorists have long recognized the tension between partisanship as the act of taking sides and democracy's ideal of an inclusive public sphere. Partisanship is this concept that we argue grounds political freedom in a kind of collective action, and the public sphere is this space that provides, that aspires rather to universality and also the mutual recognition of equal rights. So we saw these as in tension, and democratic theory, recent debates are exploring that tension a little bit further. And in memory politics, this tension appears, as we discuss, as the divide between public memory, which seeks to forge consensus around national narratives, and what we call partisan memory, which really preserves the memory and experience of conflict. So rather than treating these as incompatible poles, we argue that their dynamic interplay is actually constitutive of pluralistic democracy. And we see the last letters actually embody this interplay and express an ethical concept of partisanship that we show is rooted in the commitment to the public good as opposed to a more sectarian notion of partisanship. So I'll leave it
Great.
there as the kind of general overview.
Wonderful.
So
Daniel.
thank you, Alexandra. You must be asking yourselves, why France and why Italy? And what do the last letters have to do with memory? And so I've spent the last 5 years studying the last letters story in France and learned a lot about how they've been instrumentalized in politics and in post-war memory. And so I discovered, and you'll read about this in the article, you'll see these anthologies of last letters that we refer to. This one is the original one from 1943, Mort pour la France. This one was published in 1946, right after the war, at a really important moment of the founding of the Fourth Republic, after the war. This was a new edition. Look, it's so much thinner than this one, published in 1958 after the Gaullist coup. This one is the pocketbook one, published right after the May 68 events in 1970. And we're going to refer to the picture of the high school students. You can see it right here, how the commemoration is meant for students. And this one it's a hardcover book in the controversy in 1985, right at the end of the Cold War. And finally, all these were the Communist Party publishing them. Finally, it comes not until 2003 that there's this more universalistic, pluralistic edition that comes out at the dawn of the 21st century. I found this by chance in a Bordeaux bookstore, and that's what launched this, a chance discovery and curiosity. So France was an obvious choice for me, and I was sitting down with Alexandra, just sharing some of my research with her in a garden over espresso, and she was telling me about Gramsci and Italy, and I said, do you know anything about last letters in Italy? And she's like, I don't know. And I said, well, why don't you have a look? And we found incredible things. Italy is as obsessed as France is. So there's a book. This is the first edition in 1952. Try my Italian. Lettere di condannati a morte della Resistenza Italiana. I really had to work on my Italian in this. There's a whole Europe. Look at this. The European edition. This had to fall out in our revision stage, but there's a whole story about European last letters. This is the last letters. This is really sort of challenges agonistic memory. These are the fascist Mussolini supporters. Look at that anthology of last letters. And just to show you, they're still today. This was published in 2015. This is a contemporary edition of Italian last letters. And so we asked ourselves, if we put the two into comparison, what would we find? Are there similarities amongst the letters? Is the story about their memorial trajectory the same? What can we learn about democratic politics today? And that was the impetus behind our comparison and our conversation across the article. So you're going to read about these anthologies. I wanted to bring them to show you. And we focused on the letters, but we also focus a lot on the prefaces, because the prefaces tell us how they were instrumentalized in the political moment. So I hope you look forward to reading it.
So you mentioned it just very briefly, but this collaboration came about through a conversation, and obviously, and as I mentioned to both of you before we started recording, I can see both of your influences in this fantastic article. So if you could just speak a little bit more to the collaborative experience here.
Yeah, I guess from from my point of view, it was coming together in a conversation about the role of political parties, which is related to my dissertation research, and this tension that we see, today with our own political party politics and democracy, and thinking also about my research on Gramsci and the question of the Italian Communist Party and the influence that his thought had and his letters had on on Italian politics. There's such a long legacy of his reception in Italy. And so this kind of sparked the question of, well, if we do an empirical investigation in how the last letters were circulated, what are we going to find, comparatively speaking, between the French and Italian case? So I had this sort of hypothesis that the letters did not receive as much significance, as much influence rather, as let's say the letters of Antonio Gramsci. But to our surprise, we saw a significant influence that the letters had, specifically on the cultural sphere in Italy. So as we uncovered some of the more empirical material, we found meeting minutes by Italy's main publishing house, Einaudi Editore. And in this meeting, you have this diverse editorial board that's debating, okay, how are we going to publicize these letters? What kind of anthology do we want to construct? Unlike in France, which was a very communist-specific anthology that focused specifically on communist partisans in the resistance in France, in Italy, what you get is this multi-partisan anthology. And really, is the interesting thing that you'll see in the letter is a debate unfolds about both the national representativeness of this anthology. So the initial collection was only including letters from the North. And one of the editors said, well, you have to include Southern resistors, Southern members of the Partigiani, in order for this to be really nationally representative. The other debate centered around the highly politicized nature of the preface. As Daniel was mentioning, the prefaces really provide that window into the political moment, especially for those who are so distant from the time in which the letters were written. And so whether or not a highly politicized preface should be included in a text of such public view was really a major debate. And sure enough, it was published. So you get this really mixed anthology. But we show that, again, unlike in France, this multi-partisan anthology really runs up in tension with the mass parties of the post-war period. Funny enough, the mass parties who participated in the Italian resistance, so specifically the Italian Communist Party and also the Christian Democratic Party. I'll leave it over to Daniel to explain his kind of his understanding of the French case, because that was what he kind of brought forth to me in sort of like, how do we reconcile what happened in France with what happened in Italy?
For the sake of time, I'll allow you to read about the French case, but I just want to say one last thing about the collaboration. It really brought our strengths as scholars together. Alexandra's knowledge of democratic theory and memory politics, and the Italian case, my knowledge of the French case, and sort of my research on the lived experience of war. It allowed us to collaborate and take these texts and these really powerful letters and bring them to life in the article that you're going to read, and show really how they matter. We didn't agree on everything, rest assured. And so what you have is sort of the combination of all of our struggles and debates between us, and what we hope is going to be a really interesting piece and a contribution to memory politics, to democratic theory, and to the way we think about and live politics today.
And on that, let me just conclude with your conclusion, where you mentioned that the last letters themselves demonstrate that partisan memory need not devolve into anti-pluralist distortions or a single party's myth of national unity. On the contrary, they show how partisan remembrance can renew a pluralist democracy by reminding us that diverse actors understood their partisanship as an equal contribution to the cause of universal freedom. And that is such a great way, I think, to conclude this, a hopeful way that I think we can conclude this. So I want to thank Alexandra and Daniel for an excellent article that I hope you all very much enjoy here at the Review of International Studies.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Merci.